Thank you, Professor Boville. It's great to be here with you, and good morning to you in France today. So thank you for the opportunity to present my thesis on resilience in senior leadership in higher education. It's an investigation of perspectives, practices, and experience. And I was really drawn to this topic through my own experiences of leadership practice and also through the gap which exists in the literature, which is understood to be fragmented and comparatively understudied, as noted by Bachman et al. In 2013. The existing literature on resilience is really drawn from the fields of psychology, education, and management. And much of the research in psychology is focused on first responders and military personnel and people who see trauma in their working lives, such as nurses. And for general populations, it's focused on people who've experienced trauma and disadvantage in their childhoods. In education theory, much of the literature is focused on school settings and also classroom-facing roles. And in the general management theory, resilience study is focused on general populations of workers. And as Zumeta has noted, leaders have a very different experience of resilience in organisations. Their positions involve social distance, managing and administering conflict, supporting employees, and exhaustion in their roles. And this topic is particularly relevant to the field of higher education in Australia, as noted in the Universities Accord of 2024. Education institutions are operating in an era of profound intellectual, technological, economic, and cultural change. And also in Australia, education is a significant social and economic industry for the country. We have 1.5 million students, and our workforce requirements expect us to increase that volume of students to 1.9 million by 2050. We have 143,000 employees full-time in the sector, and universities are responsible for 36% of Australia's R&D output. In addition, we are a major exporter of education. It is our third largest industry and our largest services export industry, and generated $51 billion for the economy in 2023. So this led me to explore resilience further in an extensive literature review, following a research protocol and some practical screening, which involved forwards and backwards searches. Of the 170 peer-reviewed journal articles I referenced through the course of my project, there were a number of particularly significant resources. First of all, resilience suffers from significant conceptual confusion and also a lack of a definitive definition and tools for measurement. So the references of Sisto et al., Fisher and Asham et al. Were particularly useful in getting a broad lens of the definitions and the conceptual frameworks around resilience. The resources of Fisk and Seary were particularly important in understanding the issues of challenge as critical to resilience. Without challenge, there is no resilience, and without challenge, we can't build resilience. So challenge really is a critical feature of the resilience dialogue. And importantly, resilience is not an isomorphic construct. So I undertook some significant research of the application of resilience for individuals, teams, and organisations, and used the references of Chapman et al., Clements and Klinman, Stoverick et al., and the resource of Kahn, which outlined a theory known as the geographies of strain, which outlines that resilience, points of vulnerability in organisations can be at any area of the organisation, and it's not a homogeneous construct when we come to organisational resilience. And finally, the work of Foster and Ducek was perhaps the most closely related to my own topic of interest, which was the role of resilience for leadership. So amongst those resources, these were some of the key journals that I referenced in my work. That led me to develop a conceptual model. There were a number of conceptual models in the resources I investigated. However, I took many of the components of those models and developed a 4-quadrant framework of my own, which drew on resilience reserves, which are both state-based and trait-based, formed of innate and acquired attributes. Moving to the quadrant on the right, which is resilience experience, how we experience challenge and adversity. And where I inserted a point of difference in my conceptual model was to lean heavily into the meaning we ascribe to challenge and adversity. One person's crisis is another person's lesser inconvenience. And so the meaning we ascribe to challenge and adversity is significant both in the experience quadrant and also our processing and sense making in the third quadrant, finally leading us to resilience outcome. And a number of scholars note return to normative function as the intention of demonstrating resilience, and others espouse post-traumatic growth and returning to an expanded state of capacity and capability through the process of exercising resilience. This is a simplistic model which identifies one instance of a challenge and adversity, and it was presented with an understanding that most individuals are experiencing challenge across several domains of their life at any point in time and can be at any point in the resilience cycle across those challenges. Similarly, we don't progress purely in a simplistic cyclical orientation through the cycle. People can be triggered back to experiencing a challenge, and there can be protracted delays and procrastination in reaching outcome and resolution. However, this was a framework, a conceptual framework of resilience, which was presented in my research to candidates as part of the data collection. My research methodology was classic qualitative methodology to really gain insights rich insights from people about their experiences of resilience. And I pursued a relativist ontology because there are many perspectives. As I mentioned, people have varying experiences of the severity of certain issues. And I employed an interpretivist epistemology because even though there are very few life and death moments in the world of education, there are certainly critical incidents on campus, and most experiences are contextualized and subjective. I utilised a range of sampling methods, which I'll detail in my next slide, and my method for collecting data was via long-form, semi-structured interviews. And I progressed in that manner because of the nature of the subject I was addressing, and I wanted to afford my participants the opportunity to participate as fully or within the bounds of their own comfort in terms of speaking about challenging instances in their personal and their professional lives. From the data collection phase, I undertook a process of open axial and selective coding in order to uncover the insights from the data and derive meaning from some of the statements that were made through the process of data collection. And this inductive process was important because I wasn't applying an overarching methodology or theory to the subject. And I progressed with this inductive methodology through to feeling satisfied that I'd achieved data saturation and data sufficiency. So if I return to my sample, originally that all candidates within the sample were subjected to criterion sampling. They all had a minimum of 5 years of experience in senior leadership of teams or a function, and all had a minimum of 20 years of experience in education, employment, and in management roles. I engaged in purposeful sampling because my resources were limited and I wanted to derive as much benefit from each interview as I could. However, my initial intention was to interview a cohort from a leadership program at the University of New South Wales, and I realised that sample didn't afford me enough heterogeneity in the results I was deriving. So I engaged in some purposeful sampling to bring forward some more senior leaders and really understand the difference that experience and time in leadership made to reserves of resilience. This led to a stratification of the group across four key quadrants, which I'll outline below. And as part of the interview, I asked the candidates to refer others who they felt would have important insights to contribute to the study. So that element of opportunistic and emergent sampling was also included. However, pleasingly, all the referred candidates were candidates who were within the scope of my initial mapping. So across the 4 groups that were identified, group number 1 were long-standing mid-level managers who were responsible for implementing directives from more senior leaders in the organisation. The second group were more general managers and they had oversight of several areas of the business. and that group are typically referred to as directors, executive directors, and general managers. And then the third and the fourth group are C-suite executives. And in Australia, we refer to these leaders as deputy vice chancellors, pro vice chancellors, or vice presidents. And they have a direct reporting line to the vice chancellor. And I separated them into two groups. First group are within the first 5 years of their appointment at that level. And the second group have more than 5 years of experience at that level. In terms of my data collection, I undertook in-person interviews where it was requested and where it was culturally appropriate. So in-person interviews were offered to all of the deputy vice chancellors to afford them the greatest level of convenience and confidentiality, and virtual interviews were offered to others. There were some data collection issues with the in-person interviews. The environments were more variable and more prone to disruption, and so the virtual interviews were better for achieving consistency. In-person interviews were recorded on the phone with manual note-taking, and virtual interviews afforded the opportunity for a recorded meeting as well as a backup phone recording and note-taking. From these interviews with 26 leaders, I received 1,200 pages of raw data, which was cleansed to remove acronyms and industry terms, which didn't translate well automatically. And this information was coded into 400 data extracts, which were inserted into a modified version of the conceptual framework. And there's an example of the manual data sample there at the lower right of the screen. So these modifications to the conceptual framework, pleasingly, each of the elements in the original framework were supported and none were recommended for removal. But of the additions to the framework, 4 which are bolded on this screen were particularly prevalent. Most leaders endorsed some form of exercise and establishment of personal boundaries as key to their resilience reserves in the first quadrant. In terms of leadership, which was noted in both the second and the third quadrants, this refers to leadership of leaders. So this is the relationship that leaders had with their immediate supervisor. And the issues that most frequently detracted from leadership suitability were a lack of affinity with the leader, and second to that was inexperienced leadership, leaders who were brought in from roles which were misaligned with their current role. And that's quite common in Australian universities now. We bring people in from out of sector, believing they have insights from other industries to offer the education sector, and also frequent changes of leadership, which happens quite regularly in universities. Each of those 4 components of leadership were damaging to resilience. The one component which featured across all 4 quadrants was trust, and it was applied in different forms. So in the resilience reserves, it referred to trust of self. In the experience of challenge and adversity and processing challenge, it referred to trust of leadership and trust of colleagues and direct reports and team members. And in the final resilience outcome quadrant, it referred to trust in a better outcome as a result of experiencing challenge and adversity. Some insights, one additional insight from the resilience reserves quadrant, many leaders made reference to their upbringing, and both positive and negative childhoods, if interpreted as having benefit, were positive in generating resilience and restoring resilience. And leaders felt very strongly that they were drawn to the education sector because of conviction and passion for the intrinsic benefit of education. Interestingly, conviction and passion appeared in the third quadrant as sometimes an inhibitor to accepting change, where leaders felt particularly fixed to an outcome. But where leaders emerged as quite a distinct group was in how they process challenge and adversity. They thrive on ambiguity and uncertainty. They feel incredibly diminished when their authority and control is hampered or restricted. They identify very strongly for their capacity to deal with high volumes of workload. They reference a strong sense of perspective and the use of humour in how they engage with teams and how they manage adverse circumstances. And they all believe in a form of respite, but interestingly, it wasn't related to time away from work. It was often related to dedicated research time or the capacity to attend a conference. So when leaders spoke about respite, it was more about a change of scenery than actually stepping away from work, which was a core part of their identities. So something else, that's the aggregate level result. There were some variances in how the four groups responded to adversity. The more junior group really received directives and implemented directives. The second tier of leaders had a very strong sense of the complexity of issues and the complexity of organisations, and they had a very strong sense of their brand and how their morality and their ethical conduct within decision making impacted their presentation to their teams and also their presentation to their supervisors. Interestingly, with the C-suite executives, the more junior and recent appointments exerted more energy and felt more need to establish themselves at the C-suite level, and the most senior leaders had the strongest sense of their presence in the organisation and the greatest demonstrations of judgment and discernment in how they behaved in situations of adversity. I have noted 2 asterisks there, and that is in reference to one leader in each of the first 2 categories who had endured tremendous personal tragedy, and those particular leaders demonstrated the same levels of equanimity and perspective as the leaders who had endured the most long-standing and intensive professional challenges. So there was an alignment there between challenge in personal life and challenge in professional life. Those who had endured intensive experience both in depth and also in duration demonstrated the greatest degrees of equanimity across the 4 categories. So my findings support that perspective is incredibly important in how people perceive challenge and adversity, how they prepare themselves forward for this, and how they rebound from it. It supported the importance of practices ranging from individual exercise and boundaries through to establishing strong, trusted relationships and effective leadership relationships. And it also demonstrated the strengthening impact of experiencing challenge and diversity and adversity, which was supported in the theory by the work of Dinster and Seary and also Fredrickson. So from this, it was evident that humility and perspective was brought forward from significant loss and challenge and also significant professional testing, that leaders thrived on ambiguity, complexity, and workload, and that they really savoured their authority and autonomy and suffered greatly when it was removed, and that there's a clear decline in support as leaders ascend to the C-suite and work in the most senior roles in organisations. It was also evident that confidence and comfort with demonstrating authenticity and vulnerability was highly dependent on the nature of the relationship with others and also on the context. Most leaders provided caveats and disclaimers as to how they felt comfortable expressing authenticity. And for the most part, most leaders were very uncomfortable expressing vulnerability and felt that it didn't have a place in their leadership practice. So my recommendations emanating from the research are that we should encourage practice-based initiatives for people to restore their resilience. And I view this research as sitting adjacent to many of the mental health facilities and dialogues which take place in large organisations as a precursor or a set of tools which can be used as a preceding step to some of those more significant interventions. That as organisations, we should prioritise the development and the fostering of trust in leadership relationships, and particularly foster that through programs such as onboarding and management strategies. That we do need to devise customised resilience solutions for leaders, They don't respond particularly well to many of the leave-focused provisions which are in our employment contracts and enterprise agreements, which incentivise people to take time away from work if they're experiencing challenge through stress leave and other forms of leave. And depending on the budget and the financial position of the organisation, we can prioritise cost-effective initiatives such as alignment with existing policies and resources, or we can implement additional programs and training. Importantly, I had to establish a lot of protocols around my research to afford participants comfort that their information would be treated respectfully and confidentially. So I'm proposing the establishment of a resilience numeric scale where people can avoid disclosing detail about their circumstances and simply make reference to their resilience being a 4 out of 10 or a 6 out of 10, rather than engaging in detailed conversation about the nature of the adversity they're facing, or a traffic light system would be a similar mechanism. In terms of the contribution to theory and to practice, the conceptual framework and the modifications provide a tool for individuals and for organisations. In addition, the self-management tool is designed to build resilience awareness and to facilitate management dialogue. And the resilience roadmap is intended for people to prepare a holistic view of their resilience across personal and professional domains of their life. For organisations, these tools can be used for job design, for management of existing employees, and for identification of potential leaders. And it can be used for a tool in performance development and even in recruitment and in hiring and interviewing processes for identifying suitably resilient people for the roles they've applied for. So with that, I'd like to finish there, and I'd be pleased to take any questions you have.